Welcome, Damon. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks, Michael. Happy to be here.
So we're going to have a pretty interesting discussion around design thinking. And I think a good place to start is to maybe explain to the audience what is design thinking versus design in any other synonym for this topic.
Yeah, I think this is a question that trips a lot of people up. And so when I have my own version of that
Sure.
of that question, which is, I took a look at, and there's many, but I took a look at one of the official definitions of design.
Yeah, what is that?
And it says, it's the purpose, planning, or intention that exists behind an outcome, action, fact, or material object. And so in that definition, there's a couple words that jumped out to me. It was intention and outcome. And so my version to really simplify that definition of design is that design is the intention behind an outcome.
I like that.
And so, if we think about design thinking is a user-centered approach that helps a team form that intent together.
Okay, I like that. So if we think about this, I like one of the ways you've described it, because you're not just talking about the design process. You're talking about how do you manage a team of individuals to design something using that process. So your focus is a little bit different, because when you talk to anyone about design thinking or design, they always talk about the consumer, they talk about the product, but they never talk about how do you assemble a group of people to create that experience, what you call the end experience. So maybe let's dig into that a little bit, because I know that's a lot of what you do, right?
Yeah.
So let's assume now, I'm going to take an hypothetical example, right? And you can give me any example you want, but let's assume you have a client and they have an issue or an opportunity to have a better way of engaging their customers. How would you go about helping them through that process, assembling the team, thinking through the issues? I mean, what makes this process different from other processes?
Yeah, I think, when you think about the key phases of design thinking, that's a really great place to start.
Okay, good.
So, you really want to, understand, who your users are and understand the problem that you're trying to solve.
Yes.
That's the key coming out of the gate. And that's something that not all teams jump into right away, right? So it's like, let's get really crisp about the problem that we're trying to solve. And then, design thinking is all about then jumping in to understand who are our users, or our customers, or, the audience in which we'll be engaging with the thing that we're creating. And so it's all about building, empathy for those that are involved so that we can then start to ideate and design and prototype ideas to help meet their needs and their goals, and any pain points that these users have. And so, it's really about putting yourself in the mindset and the seat of a user so that we can then develop and design and test ideas and solutions with them. And the outcome there is that by doing so, we actually increase the original business outcome that we were trying to achieve. And so the traditional model would be, all of us behind the scenes, kind of putting our heads together, building something out, spending a year to build something that we think is incredible, only to launch it to see it fall short. Whereas by involving users and getting to building those feedback loops and understanding their needs and their goals and their pain points, it gives us a way to quickly prototype ideas, test them, and iterate on them, so that by taking this approach, a year from now, we've got version 3 or version 4 of what we were trying to create, and it's been validated and supported by the people who need it and who need to use it.
I like what you're saying. I'm going to unpack what you're saying so the audience follows it, because I think it's quite interesting. You used the word iteration a few times, but let's just unpack the implications of that, right? So typically large companies, I'm sure you work for very large companies, when they launch a product, it's usually like a 3-4 year process where they're working behind some building that nobody sees anything. And then they say, ta-da, and they unveil it and they hope there's demand, right? But what you're saying is that, no, you got to bring the consumer in very early. You got to get an early version of the product out and then keep on making adjustments. So it's almost as if the process of launching never ends because you're continuously adjusting and adjusting and adjusting until you get what you want. From a psychological perspective, I mean, most people are trained to have this big reveal and everyone drinks champagne. How do companies make that adjustment from moving away from these big launches to basically a small launch and you keep on adjusting until you get it right? I mean, talk us through how you guide clients to do that.
Yeah, and I think I love this question. It's a really good one. I think the answer, or at least the techniques or the tactics might be slightly different based on if you're building a physical product versus a digital product or a service. It's slightly different, but the overall mindset and the framework is the same. But you're right in that if you have a physical product, at some point you kind of have to draw the line and commit because there are downstream dependencies around manufacturing or marketing or sales and that sort of thing. But for everything else, especially so many experiences that are now digital and are services based, the ability to be very iterative is inherent. So if you think about, how, the App Store, for example, if you think about how software products used to be built, every year or two, there was this major marketing launch and this huge release, and everything was baked on CDs or DVDs, right? Well, now if you think about how those applications are all cloud-based or delivered through an app store, and they're constantly, continuously updated and iterated on and improved, that's kind of the same mindset we're talking about here. How do we take those best practices we've seen and sort of how most modern experiences are created and apply them to our own workplaces and to, either our customer experience or our employee experience. If you want to focus internally, the approach is similar.
Yeah, that makes sense. So in a manner of speaking, if you've got a team at a client who's responsible for, let's say, improving the service experience to check in at a hotel, and let's assume you're advising them, they're launching these apps, they're digitizing the process and so on. This is not something that you can control top down, right, with best practices. You've got to empower employees to think for themselves, test things, roll it out. Does this mean companies need to start training their employees to think more like business owners so they take accountability? And how is that happening? I mean, because I don't think most companies do that. It must be a mindset shift for them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So one of the things that we did is, we being IBM,
yes,
we're close partners with Stanford and D School, who really developed the thinking around design thinking and really came up with the phases around like understanding, exploring, prototyping, and evaluating. But one thing that we found is that in many contexts, that can still be interpreted as very like linear or very waterfall based.
Yeah.
And so if you take a look at IBM's enterprise design thinking, and we've open sourced it, so it's available to everyone, but we kind of gave it a different spin.
Okay.
This is what we use to really help scale design thinking, not just for IBM and IBMers like us, but also, like you said, with many of our clients.
Yeah.
And so I can touch on a couple of the key principles because I think that's really what we use to start to develop this mindset shift. And so the first principle is all about focusing on user outcomes, keeping our user front and center. The second is around restlessly reinventing. So kind of what we're talking about, the idea of iteration. And the third is that we do this by bringing together diverse, empowered teams. And so the more diverse the thinking on the team, the farther you can iterate and develop. And what this translates into in many cases is bringing together parts of the organization that don't typically collaborate and bringing them together to focus on a user outcome as a team.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first step, just grounding everything in these key principles. And then we have tactics that help us apply those principles.
So if you're looking at anything you're doing with a client or your own experience, how do you go about just thinking through if something's had insufficient or has the right design principles attached to it? I mean, in other words, how do you, for lack of a better word, audit something from a design thinking perspective?
That's a good question. I think there's a few different ways you can think about that. It's
Yeah.
from an outcomes perspective, if
Yes.
if you're seeing sort of lower than expected business outcomes,
Yeah.
this is probably a space in which you might
Yeah, that
consider
makes sense.
design thinking, right? So if you're seeing like I'm sort of in the camp that says anyone can do design thinking and everyone should. So no matter your role, no matter your discipline,
Yes.
no matter what part of the business you may be in, design thinking can be a key critical part of your day to day. But if you're seeing lower than expected sales or adoption or employee engagement, or if you happen to track some experience based metrics like NPS or CSAT,
Yeah.
and those aren't as high as you want. These are all potential opportunities to apply design thinking because, I would argue that just about any outcome that a business is trying to achieve has some sort of user component
Yeah.
that we can really dive into to better understand and improve those business metrics by focusing on understanding those users that are involved with that outcome.
So the idea of thinking about the outcome or the experience for the end user, the customer, the client, that would seem to be very intuitive that you should be doing it anyway, even if you've never heard of design thinking, right? I mean, what are you doing if you're not building it for a customer? So my question, which may seem very obvious, is why don't people do this intuitively?
I think people, and I have a great example here. A few years back, we built a employee experience team in our HR organization.
Mm-hmm.
And you would kind of assume the same thought, right? Like, well, it's human resources. Of course it's human centered or user
Yes.
centered or employee centered. And what we quickly understood is that yes, absolutely that was the intent. But when it comes to the skills and the tools and the techniques in order to take a truly employee centered approach, um, you know, that didn't really exist.
Yeah.
It's because these principles and these tools and these techniques have grown and flourished in sort of the product spaces of companies
Yes.
or in the technical parts of companies. And it's turned into a whole industry around customer experience, CX.
Yeah.
And so now we're taking those same practices and principles and bringing them internally to create EX, which is employee experience.
Mm-hmm.
And so bringing, those skills, those techniques, those tools to HR organizations and HR professionals, what is new?
Yeah.
The other sort of anti-pattern that we quickly uncovered is that, HR professionals would say, I'm a deep, deep subject matter expert in the policies and the
Yes.
procedures and sort of the programs around HR. I'm also an employee. So therefore, we build these things, we create
Yeah.
these programs and these experiences. And it wasn't until we used one of the keys of design thinking, which is to recruit sponsor users, find some of these representatives of the user base that you have and bring them into the process from the very beginning. And so when we brought in the sponsor users, after a time or two, you could see where the light bulb went off. And it's like, wow, the everyday, employee that's not in HR, they experience and think about and understand these concepts and these programs very, very differently
Mm-hmm.
than we do. And it wasn't until we actually brought them in and co-created using design thinking, co-created these experiences with them, that they really understand the value of taking that kind of an approach.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's almost as if there's two issues here, and correct me if I'm wrong. I think the one is that if you call yourself an expert at something, or you consider yourself an expert, it's very hard to acknowledge that maybe there's a better way of doing something, right? Because you've already kind of pigeoned yourself into being called an expert. So this entire worldview of saying we can always be better, and then you say you're an expert. So I can see why internal people in any company would struggle with this, right? Because
I like
you're an
that thought.
expert.
I think I'll start calling myself a fan of something or
Yeah, exactly.
passionate about
And then,
something.
when you were
That's
talking about
really
this idea of bringing clients in, it makes sense because if you look at something 15 times or more, in your case, probably thousands of times, you are going to be blinded to some obvious blind spots because you just seen them so many times. And it's not because you cannot see the problem. It's that because you're an expert in your mind, you can justify how to work around it. But the end user and the client doesn't want to work around it. They just want the easiest route. So let's just think about the implication of this, right? Does this mean that every single team that's building something for a customer or client should be working with the client right from the get-go? No skunk works alone in private, without the world seeing what you're doing. It's a fundamental shift, right?
I think so. Yeah. When you talk about that transparency of co-creation and feedback and iterating based on that feedback,
Yeah.
I think you get to outcomes, and actually we did a study on it. We hired Forrester to come and not just look at IBM, but many of our partners that
Yes.
are using a design thinking approach. And they actually found, the evidence that sort of backs up what I'm going to say. But it really came down to three key metrics that we were able to surface in this Forrester report, and it was in 2018. But it was, we saw a 2x faster to market number
Yeah.
by reducing the design time and reducing the testing time of many
Yes.
of these solutions. We were able to also, number two was that we could, we increased our ROI by 300% by lowering, labor costs, by reducing features that we weren't
Yeah.
using, processes that didn't resonate with users, so it really helps you sort of focus and scope really well to increase your ROI. And then the last piece, and this is, I think, one of the best ones, it really comes down to helping teams align and focus on a shared user outcome
Yes.
that, again, drives that business value. And we saw an 80% increase in the alignment and focus of teams.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, you touched on quite an important point here. A lot of the discussion we had about working with end users or customers, consumers to build the product, build the service, is about how to come up with the best experience for them. But you also talked about reducing the time to market, which is in itself an enormous business case. It's one thing to say that, well, we could get to the same answer as the client without working with the client. But it's quite another thing to say that, well, if we worked with the client, we'd avoid 10 iterations because the client would tell us that this just is never going to work. So we can get there with 4 iterations. And I remember reading a study lately, I don't know who published it, but it said that the number one issue facing financial services companies is not coming up with the best solution. It's about coming up with the best solution in as fast as way possible.
Mm-hmm.
Because the one who comes up with the best solution first has first mover advantage, right? You move in first, you capture the majority of the market. So now thinking about design thinking, right? You have employees, you obviously want to bring the skill to them, whether it's IBM or clients. Is it a function of teaching them to think differently, or is it a function of incentivizing them to focus on different things? Is it a skills gap issue, or is it because we don't incentivize employees and clients don't incentivize employees to focus on working with consumers, focusing on iterations? Where does it lie in the spectrum? How do we manage that?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit of both. So I think when it comes to, and I'll start with the second part first, which is the incentives. And I think here is where it's incumbent on leaders and the leadership teams to create a culture and an environment of design thinking where it can flourish. Because there's nothing that'll shut it down faster than an unsupportive leader, right?
Yeah.
And so when we enable our leaders and our executives, we turn them into design thinking advocates, we call it. And the advocates have, we kind of give them three examples of what makes a great executive or leadership advocate for design thinking, and it's that they support and engage teams, throughout EDT projects and work, that they choose and launch initiatives that deliver, opportunities for human-centered innovation, and third, that they scale and promote a culture of design thinking throughout their organizations. So I think, setting up the culture in which design thinking can flourish is really important. On the flip side, your first point around skills, that's also incredibly important.
Yeah.
So we have, for us and our customers and our clients, again, we developed IBM Design Thinking, and we set up a whole digital credentialing program around developing the skills for design thinking. And so we have multiple what we call badges or digital credentials that start with, just how to understand what design thinking is, and that's practitioner, all the way up through multiple different kind of levels or maturity of design thinking, all the way up to a design thinking leader. And not that everyone has to have the same levels, because we actually find that the best design thinking teams have, yes, they have a leader, but yes, they have many practitioners or co-creators, at the bottom, and then they have a coach. And a design thinking coach is kind of that magic person that really brings it all together, both for the team and helps align with the stakeholders and the leaders as well. And so a nice, healthy design thinking team kind of has those different levels of skills kind of all applied at the same time.
But at the end of the day, the ultimate measure is whether there's an improvement, right? Did they make the experience better? Is the product better? Does this work better? Is it faster to market? I mean, that's how they're going to be measured.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to, what we were talking about a little while ago, which is before you even get started, you have to get crisp about, all right, we're going to bring together, this diverse and empowered team, but what's the problem that we want them to help us solve, or what's the need that we're trying to meet, and not just getting real crisp about that problem statement, but also what are those business metrics around this problem statement that we can measure, not just now so that we have a starting place, but measure them after so that we can make sure we're moving the needle. Because I think one thing that's really important is that as design thinkers, or if you're a design professional, or an experienced person, we can jump in and we can improve any experience. That's kind of the easy part. But in a business context, we need to always make sure that we are prioritizing and investing this skill, this capability that we have, on things that are really going to move the business forward or achieve the business outcomes that we need to achieve. I think that's incredibly important.
That makes sense. Let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the elephant in the room, right? So before this conversation, I went to the Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and I typed in design thinking and looked at the top 10 articles that came up, sorted by relevance. All of them were about product design. But the United States is a service-based economy.
Yeah.
But it's almost impossible to find good examples that is not about Apple, not about Tesla, or some physical product you can touch and feel. I mean, do you feel that there's an opportunity to get American leaders thinking more about service design principles? Do you feel there's a big gap? Do you think we're missing something? We're missing a trick here in corporate America?
Yeah, I think many are doing it. They just may not be thinking of it under these labels. But as an example, I would say, if we're talking about physical products, that's kind of one thing. And we touched on that a little bit earlier. But like you said, many of our experiences now are digital, or our products are digital, or we're providing some sort of service. And that could be a digital service or a physical service. And in all of those use cases, what you said around service design, that is one of the key methods we use to apply design thinking, to improving these user journeys. And so, I talked a little bit earlier about, customer experience, CX, which is based on user experience, UX,
Yeah.
and then how teams like mine are taking those practices and principles and applying them internally to companies around employee experience or EX. But all of those use the same methods
Hmm.
around, developing personas so we can better understand our users, doing user research, developing journeys, and using service design methods to
Yeah.
really take a look at all the different layers to a journey that our users have. I know we haven't really talked much about journey, so hopefully people know what I mean, but I can give a quick example. But really using service design to understand what's the journey that our customer or our employee or our user is taking, and what can we do at each step of the way to improve or enhance or drive the outcomes within that experience that we're trying to drive.
Well, maybe explain journey so the audience knows. I think I know what it means, but maybe you have a different definition of it.
Sure. So, in its basic form, I often talk about, a journey is just based on a need.
Hmm.
And so we have a user has a need, and and in order to accomplish that need, they have they're starting from one place and they're ending by meeting that need. And so what we do from a service design perspective is we start to map out what are the phases that a user is going through. Um, and just to make it real, let's talk about onboarding. So let's say you're going to join a new company or you were recently hired. So, how did you apply with that company? How did you become aware?
Yes.
Once you applied, there was the interview experience. That would be like a phase. And then, leading up to your day one experience, like that could be another phase. And then what happens after day one
Hmm.
until you're really ready to work. And so by looking at these phases and then getting more and more specific, what are the steps of each phase?
Yeah.
And are there any moments that matter? And these would be steps or moments in this journey that if we get them right, elevate the experience of the entire journey
Hmm.
that this user has. But if we get them wrong, pulls down their experience. And so in the case of this example we're talking about, like think about that day one experience when you come into the office for the first time, or maybe these days when you sign into
Yeah.
Zoom for the first time to meet your team. But think about that day one experience, and we call that a moment that matters, because if that experience doesn't go well, how they perceive the entire journey is going to drop. And so as we map out these steps and these phases across this journey, we start to look deeper and deeper into what powers that journey.
Hmm.
So what are those touch points that the employee or the user has? What tools do they engage with? Who do they meet with along this journey? And then if we even start to go deeper, what are the HR teams or the CIO teams? What are they doing behind the scenes to power that journey? Even deeper, are there technologies or technical platforms that are being used to power that journey? And at the very bottom, you know, the data that's being used along this journey, where's that data coming from?
Hmm.
What's the quality of that data and the performance of that data? So service design helps us really map those journeys and then go as deep as we need to understand and improve that journey, so that that experience at the top that the user is having, is getting better and better and driving the outcomes that we want to drive.
But this sounds like a lot of work. If a company is going to be doing this for every single, because when you talk about customers, you also talk about employees, not just outside customers, right? Employees of a company are a form of customers. So if you're mapping out all these touch points, it's a lot of work. How do you prioritize this?
Yeah, it can be, and so that's why I think prioritization and scoping is incredibly important. So when it comes to, we usually say like, well, let's take a look at what's most strategic to your organization. What strategy are you trying to execute? That could be a great place to start. Another thing to take a look at would be, what business outcomes are you trying to drive that either you're currently not meeting, or you're not performing as well as you would like, or there's some new outcome that you're trying to achieve. And so those are also good opportunities to take a look at, elevating on your priority list.
So is design thinking something that's a company needs to control, like the CFO function? With tight controls as a center of, let's use an old word, center of excellence, with all of the main ideas sitting in one repository and sent out as needed? Or is this something that needs to be propagated across the company with no real owner, but just a culture and a philosophy?
I've seen it done both ways
Yeah.
and multiple ways, honestly. From IBM's point of view, we set off to do our design thinking transformation in a large scaled enterprise level
Hmm.
way. And so, of course, we couldn't do it all at once. We
Yeah.
still have to find ways to scale it out, but it was enterprise wide from the onset as far as the outcome that we wanted to achieve. And so, one of the things that was important is that we created a sustainable culture of design and
Hmm.
design thinking, and we always had that outcome in mind from the beginning. And so, for us, it was about doing it in phases. How do we identify those top most impactful projects or outcomes that we could drive, and using that as a way to then socialize and scale the impact of design thinking, so that today we have over, oh gosh, and I'm recorded, so you're going to have to quote me, but over 200, maybe even over 250,000 now design thinkers within IBM, and it's probably,
250,000. That's
yeah.
bigger than most cities.
Yeah, and by having this ability to have these digital credentials that articulate, how deep or how mature someone's skill set is, we're really able to sort of measure and sort of provide programs and experiences around it, which is great.
So let's step back here, right? If design thinking is such an advantage for a company, which it is, I'm not debating that. I don't think anyone's going to debate that. How do you protect this advantage? How do you nurture it? I mean, we spoke about the culture and so on, right? But then is it just a function of making sure these 10 leaders in design don't leave the company? I mean, how do you put your hands around this advantage? How do you protect it? What does a company do once it's developed this?
Yeah, so I think there's a few things that we've done that I think are tremendously helpful. One is that, again, we sought out to make this a sustainable culture over time. So instead of having a center of competency around design or design thinking, from the onset we developed a distributed model. So we have designers, design thinkers, design leaders in every business unit across IBM, product and non-product. And what this does is this helps us infuse this mindset and this framework. And what it's created was this ability to make it part of our business as usual. It's not this thing you do on the side. It's not this thing where there's a dedicated SWAT team somewhere
Yeah.
that call in once a year. This is something that's ingrained throughout almost every corner of our company now, and I think that that's been incredibly helpful, and that has helped inform kind of the management model and the leadership model of how that's all sort of scaled. Also, some of the things that we've done from a grassroots perspective have helped ensure that it flourishes. So, for example, we don't organize them, we don't lead them, but we provide support for an entire network of design thinking. We call them chapters.
Mm-hmm.
So for each site or city where IBM has a presence, we have design thinkers that organize their local communities, and they do enablement. They participate in workshops together. They go out into the community, and with charities or nonprofits, they use design thinking to support them as well. And so this culture around at the local level and at the sort of individual teams driving that culture is great, because we're driving it from the bottom, we're driving it from the top, and it's really become a mindset throughout our entire organization.
So what I hear you saying is that it's almost like within the blood of IBM. it's not isolated to a few people. It's actually a very hard competitive advantage to steal because it's the culture. It's diffused throughout the organization.
Yeah, I would say that that's absolutely true. The other thing that is very helpful, and I would say especially now more than ever, considering how everything is mostly virtualized and remote, is that it also takes, the right tooling. So if you in your Google search, you probably saw a whole lot of sticky notes and walls and Sharpies
Yeah, that's true.
and that stuff is fantastic. But design thinking isn't always a workshop.
Yeah.
Actually, most times it's not a workshop. But when you see images of it, that's usually how it's brought to life. And I could talk about that for an hour. But the tooling is important. So when you're all together physically, you can use Sharpies and sticky notes
Yeah.
and walls, and the activities really come to life in that way. When you're remote, using virtual tools to collaborate is really important. So, in our toolbox, we have things like Slack and Trello and Box.
Okay.
But for this like live kind of post-it inspired collaboration, we really like Mural, and it's a virtual tool that allows us to collaborate in this kind of. And there are many other tools that help with this kind of virtual collaboration, but I think now more than ever, that tooling support is also key.
But you said something quite interesting because those post-it images, which are ubiquitous on the internet, when you type in innovation, it's the artist's interpretation of what innovation is about, right? Mm-hmm. It's his interpretation or her interpretation. And then you said something which I think is worth exploring when you said that a lot of it is not team-based. So talk us through that, because a lot of times when you think about innovation, you always think there must be a group involved, whether it's a workshop, but you're talking about innovation whereby you may be working alone. So talk us through that. I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, I would say it's always absolutely team-based. I mean, sure. That's one of the principles of design thinking is bringing together a diverse, empowered team. Mm-hmm. Now, that could be physically, it could be virtually, and now more than ever, it's much more virtual than it had in the past. I think probably what you picked up on was when I was talking about it's design thinking is not a workshop.
Yes.
And when you look online, when you look at the articles and the stories, the photographs or the images that are always portrayed are these physical post-it workshops with
all these beautiful people.
Yeah. Which, yes, are fantastic. It's a way to bring people together for a dedicated amount of time to focus on design thinking, bring in sponsor users. Workshops are incredibly important. However, that's not where the design thinking stops. And that's where I see an anti-pattern pop up when people are newly learning about design thinking, or when organizations and companies are applying design thinking for the first time, is that, usually your first experience with design thinking is through a workshop.
Yeah.
But if you're not carrying this design thinking mindset with you and with the team after the workshop and weaving it into your day-to-day, that's where things can really fall short. You come up with great ideas, you have this very
that makes sense.
Incredible experience in the workshop. But if you don't translate those outcomes and those insights that you develop in the workshop into deliverable operational outcomes, and continue to use design thinking to iterate during your delivery process, that's where things really fall short. And so one of my biggest tenets is always design thinking is not a workshop.
Yes, that's a good point, because you may get together with your colleagues and brainstorm some ideas, come up with some good concepts, but then you got to leave that workshop and still continue to apply design thinking as you do your piece of work. And together you've got to roll out some product or service and then keep on adjusting it. I think that's a good point, because we do tend to think of design thinking as a workshop. It's almost something we take for granted. So we spoke about the value of design thinking. I think we know that. If we had this discussion 20 years ago, people would have said yeah, we're not sure if it makes sense, but now I think the world knows design thinking is valuable. But there are different degrees of what is good design thinking versus sort of entry level design thinking. So if I'm a CEO or business unit leader, how do I know I have the right, that I'm applying the right design thinking? Because, design thinking is one of those nebulous concepts. It's like everyone's a social media expert. And
Hmm.
now today, a lot of people say they know design thinking, but how do you know this is the right design thinking?
I love this question because I get it with many of the clients that we work with, right?
Yeah.
Like this is kind of one of their big questions off the top, especially if we're meeting with the leadership teams.
Yeah.
And we talked about this before earlier about how to be a good executive advocate, and
Yes.
we talked through those principles. Some of the questions I often arm them with to help them understand, like, are we doing it? Are we really kind of internalizing this and
Yes.
moving it into our operations and our management systems? So here's a few questions that I typically would ask them,
Sure.
or ask them to ask themselves or their teams. Are their teams immersing themselves in their users' world? And do you have evidence of that? Do you have qualitative or quantitative data about your users? Do you have, are your teams performing user research, and do you have insights and data from that research? Have you instrumented things, NPS or CSAT
Yeah.
to measure their experience? So are you seeing evidence that your teams are immersing themselves in whoever your identified users are? The second question, I touched on it a little bit,
Hmm.
is, are your teams using data? Are they using data? Are they using, and I mean user data?
Yes.
Are they using feedback? Do they have feedback channels built into their programs and their experiences? And are they using that data and that feedback not just to react to it, but to bring it all together and as a team converge or develop a point of view or insights around what this feedback and what the data is telling them, so that they can then, from an informed position, again, having this very diverse team, this is where the diversity really
Mm-hmm.
comes into play. When you're looking at data, feedback, and input, the more diverse perspectives you can bring to review that data so that you can develop insights from it is really key. The third question I ask them are you seeing evidence of your teams, testing and prototyping ideas with users instead of, building something out
Yeah.
and seeing what happens? Are they doing paper prototypes or coded prototypes? Are they doing these really low fidelity things that they can put in front of users to get feedback before we spend a whole lot of money on it? That's another great question. And then the last one that I often push them on is, obviously as leaders, you have, some sort of stakeholder updates or cadence, or if you're an agile organization, you have showcases or other ceremonies. Are these stakeholder updates or showcases, are they story driven, and do they focus on the journey or experience of users? Because if that's not how you're getting updates around
Yes.
your programs and your solutions, then that's probably more evidence that maybe they're not applying as much design thinking as you would hope.
Yeah, I think that's a good set of questions. I like that. As you were going through that list, I was actually answering them myself and thinking, do we do that? Because I think that's a good test of a set of questions. Is it practical? Because if it's impractical, I would just be not paying attention. But I was thinking about, do we do this? Why don't we do this? What parts do we do well? What parts could we do better? And I think it makes sense. So, as you help clients with this, right? What are some good examples you've seen where clients have applied design thinking to get results quickly? Because I think one of the challenges, as you say, is clients want results fast
Mhm.
and they don't want to wait 10 years for something. But at the same time, they want to get something quick so they can build on it. So if you were advising executives, what would you advise them as they were trying to apply design thinking? What would be some of those best practices that you've seen internally at IBM and also with clients?
Yeah, I think so. I'll start with one part and then I'll give a couple examples. I think one of the things that that you can do, and this is kind of a broader
Sure.
design answer than just design thinking. Design thinking is a part of this, but from a design perspective, have you elevated experience and design to be a part of the strategy and the leadership conversations and the decision making process? Companies that we see are being very successful have done that. Whether they're successful
Hmm.
consumer products in the market or successful services based companies, you can tell, and there's evidence that these companies have spent a tremendous amount of time thinking about and investing in the experience that they're providing to their users. And we often talk about the three in a box model,
Hmm.
which is for successful innovation, you know, you have to have three key points of view. The design point of view, which is around user
Yeah.
desirability. And the second point of view is the business point of view, and is something viable in our market. And then the third point of view is around either engineering or delivery. But is this what's the build feasibility
Yes.
of this outcome? And so all three of those really need to be have an equal seat at the table and be an equal part of that
Hmm.
of the strategy. Because if you're missing one of those three, you know you're probably going to fall short or not have the
Yes.
kind of innovation that you're hoping to achieve.
Yeah. I mean, if I want to come back to this point because I think it's something we have to get the listeners to break their minds from thinking about this is that we always think about design as something looking good. But this entire discussion was not about anything looking good. Yeah, if this wants to look good, it's okay. But does it solve a real customer pain point?
Yep, and
Does
that
it,
is what design is all about. And what you're talking about, how things look, that is a thin slice of design, but it's
yes,
visual design and what things look like. And visual design can have an incredible impact on how something is received and
yes,
perceived and lands on a user. But yeah, there's much more to design, and it's really about, like you said, how are we solving the problem we set out to solve. And it's not just what something looks like, but it's how it works, how we're achieving that outcome, or how we're helping and empowering the user to achieve the outcome that they're trying to achieve.
yeah. It's almost as if you want to apply all of these design principles you were speaking about, which makes sense to me, you articulate them very well. You first have to fix the problem and fix it to the best way that suits the needs of the customer, right? I think that's the starting point. Unless you do that, it's not really going to work. But once you
Yeah,
fix the problem, assuming there's a visual component to your solution, whether it's a app or a earphones or whatever it is, then you can make it look good. But if you just make it look good and it doesn't fix the underlying problem, you haven't actually applied design thinking, right?
yeah, you're right. And I would say I would even add a step before
Yeah,
fixing the problem, which is, do we even understand the problem?
yeah.
And that understanding, is that work up front to really, get understand the business sort of challenges involved, but again, those users that are involved, who are they, what are their needs and their goals, because it's through that lens that we're then able to come up with, like you said, then ways to solve that problem or fix that problem or achieve that goal. And by going through that lens, that user lens, the idea is that you're able to come up with, and the innovation you can drive is far greater than the traditional methods.
So it all comes down to understanding the end user. How do you understand the end user? I mean, you mentioned surveys, reports, but is it a question of watching the end user, spending a day in their life? What's the best way? I mean, we mostly talk about services innovation, which I think is most interesting. But how would you? Let's assume you had a client who was a major pharmaceutical company, for example, and they brought you in and said, "Okay, we want to know how to get the most from our employees. Right? How do we get the most from it? How would you understand the life of the employee? What would be the pro? I mean, I need to know this. Right? It's quite interesting. I mean, do you put those drones flying across the office? What's the
Yeah.
process?
So I would say this is a fun example because it's not that far off from what we hear
Yeah,
sometimes. The first order of business would be to get much more specific than how do I get the most out of the
yeah,
employee? Because that's the ocean. We can't boil
Yes.
the ocean, right? So like is we would help them really narrow in on what are those key outcomes that we're hoping that to get out of these this segment of your employee population. And we would develop a persona or multiple personas to better understand who they are. And then depending on what specific outcomes we were hoping to drive, that's where we would decide what's the best way to truly understand and build empathy around this user. And it could be everything from quantitative research,
Yeah.
so surveys, interviews, that sort of thing, to qualitative research, which would be more long form interviews and conversations to really get in there. It could also be things like contextual inquiry,
Hmm.
which is the design research nerd term for actually going, like you
Yeah.
said, and watching and observing what these users do and how they do it, looking again for those opportunities that wouldn't otherwise surface. So yeah, there's lots of different ways, but the two main buckets are, you know, quantitatively, what data can we get, or what data do we already have? That's something that's often overlooked, especially in the case of this example, which is like an employee example. We probably have tremendous amount of data,
Yeah.
not just kind of HR data about our employees, but data around the tools and the programs and the policies that are being used and engaged, and what insights can we develop from all this data, in addition to more of this qualitative evidence around like I said, interviews or actually spending time with those users. The last piece, kind of going back to that idea of sponsor users,
Yeah.
is we would actually recruit actual sponsor users to join our team, to help inform the solutions and the ideas, and as we progress forward.
That's interesting. Now, I want to touch on two things you mentioned, which is very interesting for me. You said that you need to have empathy for the end user. Because when you talk about design, there's almost infatuation with mathematical precision, right? I mean, that's the kind of sense I get when I talk to designers. They seem to be very obsessed with whether something is perfect. But what you're talking about is, and I'm going to give you this as a question, can you truly embrace design thinking if the end goal is not to empathize with the end user?
I think empathy is so inherent to the process
Yeah.
that you can't really do design. I mean, that's part of what design thinking is all about. The first principle is design thinking is that user centered outcome, and to understand the user and the outcome, you know developing empathy around their goals, their needs, their pain points, you know
But I think
understand.
it's worth for people to understand that, because too often when we talk about understanding customers and end users, we use terminology from business schools, right? End user, segments, pain points. I mean, we sound like a pharmaceutical commercial, but my point is, what you say is very true. Unless you can put your shoes in that end user and empathize with the pain they're going through and the discomfort, it's going to be very difficult for you to redesign a process to make their life easier.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And by uncovering, and this is what's so, I think this is what designers are so great at. And as people
Yeah.
get more and more comfortable with design thinking who aren't designers, because again, anyone in any role can practice design thinking and should, but you get much more comfortable with
Yes.
uncovering and talking about those pain points or
Yeah.
those gaps that get uncovered, because every one of those parts of the process or the experience that we uncover are falling short, those are opportunities
Yes.
to improve that experience, but by not just for the sake of improving the experience for the
Yeah.
user, which is fantastic. I mean, it's not to be sort of downplayed, but we do it because we're trying to elevate the business outcome of that, that experience is a part of. And so, as we get more and more comfortable with, critical feedback and talking about pain points and gaps and friction in these experiences, we turn all of that knowledge into insights to improve and to iterate on those experiences to, again, achieve those even better business outcomes.
Yeah, because I mean, if you truly care about what your clients are going through, you don't see their pain points as something to hide or annoyance and irritation. You think of it and say, okay, this really upsets them. How can we make this better? So it's not only making their lives better, but it becomes a competitive advantage for us because we can serve them better than someone else, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So you start to see teams that get really mature in this start to think of it as a gift, right? They get excited,
Yes,
like, oh, we got a piece of negative feedback. Like this is
exactly.
fantastic. Where in the old world, it would be like, oh man, like
Yeah,
hide
let's
that,
hide it. Let's hide it from the
downplay that.
boss.
Yeah,
But it's good because, whenever we talk about design and design thinking, for me, it's too much about perfection. It's about visual identity. But yeah, really, it's about caring. And if you care enough, you'll do something about it. But it's a win-win situation, right? The company produces something that the customer buys, and the customer is buying something because it makes their life easier. It's capitalism at its best.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
I want to touch on one more point because I know we're running out of time a little bit here.
Sure.
And it's an interesting point, which you didn't make explicitly, but you alluded to it about 50 times. It sounds like IBM's model is to roll out things and experiment with it internally first before it takes it to clients, at least in your situation. Because every example that we spoke about, you had an IBM example first before you spoke about a client example.
Yeah, I would say.
That sounds interesting. It sounds good to me, actually.
It's an interesting observation. It's probably more of a reflection of my experience because I've spent most of my recent career internally focused and have recently shifted externally to help all of our clients with their employee experience. So it's probably more of a reflection there. I would say it's also that, we started our design thinking journey, in 2012, 2013.
Oh, wow.
So we've been on this journey for a long, long time. And many of our clients are earlier in their journeys. And so we're taking a lot of what we learned from our design thinking transformation, and we're applying those lessons learned, both positive and negative, with our clients. And so I think that's probably some of the stuff that you're picking up on. I would say the one piece I would correct is that it's not that we're doing prototyping and testing kind of behind the scenes,
Sure.
and then taking it to a client, because that's kind of breaking the whole model
Sure.
of design thinking. Instead, what we're doing, and we've developed a garage method all around the world where we bring clients and IBMers together in what we call these garages and these garage design thinking sessions, and we are co-creating with them and prototyping things with them, just as we would with any kind of internal project.
I like the word garages. Who came up with that word?
I don't know.
It's a brilliant word. It has a bit of a industrial punk feel to it, a bit cool, but it makes sense. Damon, thank you so much. I actually enjoyed this immensely. It's always good when you have a conversation that makes you rethink some of your preconceptions. So I like the way that it's all about caring about your customers. I mean, that's what it is, right? And then it's a set of principles which you need to apply to make sure that if you're caring, you're doing something about it.
Yeah, absolutely. And, when it comes down to it, almost all business, is around people.
Yeah.
And design thinking is an incredible way to stay, people-centered.
Fantastic. Well said. Thank you so much, Damon. Have a good day.
Thanks for having me. Thanks, Michael.
And that's it for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed doing the episode. Finally, I want you to remember that the only way to get access to our special offers, the only way to get our special pricing, and the only way to get samples of our content is to join the list on firmsconsulting.com. It's the only way also to get access to our unique advanced content that we make available to insiders. So if you want to get a sneak peek of things, test it out, see what's in there, this is the place to go. And finally, I want to thank you again for making us one of the largest podcast channels around the world for careers and for the 2 million downloads and counting.